Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score podcast. Today, my guest is Christopher Willis. Now, Chris is best known for scoring the show Veep, scoring films like The Personal History of David Copperfield and The Death of Stalin, as well as a number of animated shorts, particularly Mickey Mouse related. So he's really brought this exciting, refreshing orchestral style with him, I think maybe influenced a bit by his expertise and study of 18th century music. And now today we talk about his latest works. One is the animated film Lamya's Poem, and the other, and this is very brief near the end, is talking about his score for the last episode of the latest series of Black Mirror, Demon 79. And our conversation on that's really interesting because you hear Chris's work and you expect a bit of tradition there, and yet he talks about how much he likes horror music, especially the music of Joseph Bishara, and how much he wants to do that in the future, at least try his hand with it. It's a little bit unexpected. Now, but it takes us, as you might expect at this point, a little while to get to all of those. We jump on a lot of other topics in between, and Chris even gives his thoughts on AI in music and film music in particular. Now, of course, you can find out more about Chris on his website, on social media. You can do the same for me. Season 4 is up and running now. It's the second interview, and I have, 4 more in the works already, so I can say it's going to be an exciting season. But until those come out, sit back and enjoy. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. How have you been?
Oh, lovely to be here. I'm good, thank you. I'm a little tired all the time at the moment. I have a little boy who's just turned... Actually, he's about to turn 2 months. He's between 8 weeks and 2 months right now. I have to say my wife, Elyse, is doing all of the heavy lifting at the moment in the middle of the night. So I'm not nearly as tired as I thought I would be. But yeah, I'm just in the process of figuring out the job that we do in combination with a little baby. But it's glorious, so it's all good.
That's great. Well, congratulations. And if we hear a baby crying in the background and you have to run out abruptly, I'll know why.
I've run away all the way to my studio, so we won't. Yeah, I'm being naughty.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think is your wife a singer as well? And the two of you actually have worked on some projects together. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
How has that been working together? I know that sometimes working on a series, for instance, it's a lot of work, tight timelines. Hopefully that doesn't ever introduce any sort of conflict.
Yeah, it's I mean, we have a massive amount in common, and so it's sort of the main thing we've done is write songs, I should say, mostly for the various Mickey Mouse cartoons that I've done. There are 2 iterations: the Mickey Mouse shorts and then the Wonderful World of Mickey Mouse. And she sort of came on gradually over the course of the shorts, and then came on officially in the Wonderful World. Although by that time she'd been actually writing lyrics, and we'd been writing songs together for a while. And we did the song in our Disney World and Disneyland ride as well. There's a ride based on Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway, and we wrote that song together too. Well, so in that sense, it's great. You know, we have a shared language and a shared sense of humor, and sort of complement each other in terms of our musical interests are heavily overlap, but not entirely. You know, she knows much more about musicals, about Broadway than I do, and I have this questionable in terms of usefulness, but this, you know, this I've leaned very classical. Used to be a musicologist, and so that's all very good. But no, as you say, it's tricky. I feel like every song we've ever written has been a little bit of an experiment in how exactly you're supposed to do it, what's supposed to come first, and how much to sort of push back, or how much when to believe that what you've got so far is basically right. You know, when to move forward and when to throw things away. I think I'm worse at it. My problem is if I'm working entirely with myself, then I'm a very nice person in everyday life, I think. I'm quite polite. But when I'm working with myself, my criticisms are just entirely turned on myself. I'm quite mean to myself, really. I throw a lot of ideas away, or I just put things to one side. So we have a lot of shared interest, and in that way we bounce ideas off each other very, very easily. But as you say, it's always tricky. It's very hard to know when to abandon an idea, how much to criticize an idea, how much to sort of nurture an idea and say, this is the idea, let's move forward with it. And I feel like I'm not as good at working closely with another person as I would like to be. Because if I'm working entirely with myself, I'm being very, very critical. I'm sort of taking an idea, and as soon as I have a bad feeling about it, I sort of put it to one side and try and come up with another one. And then I kind of look at the two of them and put them head to head. And I don't want to, it's hard to be that sort of mean to another person. I'm not sure it's helpful or appropriate. But then, so I don't, am I just going to be really nice? So I haven't quite figured that out. I'm making it sound like I'm a monster. It's been glorious, and we're hoping that hopefully there will be some more opportunities to write songs together again soon, because we've had some great times, and there's been some ones that have been very funny and that have definitely struck a chord. We'll meet families, we'll meet kids, and realize that they know the songs, they sing the songs. You go to Disney World and you see the lyrics from our song on T-shirts and stuff. So it's been a very gratifying, very kind of beautiful thing. So hopefully we'll be able to do more of it.
That aspect has to be a little exciting as well, where I'm sure your son, and I'll put my ignorance of the developmental stages of children right up front, but I assume at 2 months I don't think babies are necessarily listening or reacting to music. Maybe they are, but that as he grows a little older, hopefully that'll sort of be something that he can experience and enjoy, and be kind of something that you can give him almost unintentionally.
It's definitely, yeah. We sort of joke about the fact that we really don't have no idea what he's going to be into, but he's getting a lot of music right now. Each of us keeps playing the things that we like. I'll realize across the house that she's playing Hairspray to him, or she'll come in and I'm playing, Bach cantatas. But yeah, no, you're right. They're the early stages. They don't do a lot, babies. Actually, it's almost like when they're born. It's almost like they have a sort of basic firmware, and they haven't actually loaded up their operating system yet. They root around and they suck, and they look for milk and they cry. They don't really do anything else yet. But yeah, if he's, I don't know if any of it's going in, but there's a lot of music happening. Go for things that have bouncy rhythms. We've got this playlist building up and up and up of all these things that we've been playing.
That's great. I'm getting us totally off track, but I had some of my in-laws over from the UK earlier this year, and my niece at the time was about 20 months old, and it's funny, the music, the songs that will just resonate and make them obsessed. Unfortunately, it happened to be the songs of Cocomelon, so I heard those endless hours, but it is such a resonant thing. Oh yes, oh yes.
It's funny because the books, when the baby's teeny tiny, the books talk about repeating things, but when you're not really getting much feedback, it seems weird and silly to repeat things. Although I'm sure once you get later and realize how much they want that, it really starts to click.
You mentioned this a couple times, both directly, indirectly, going back to some of your musicology roots. And I think you had a particular focus in 18th century music. And when we think of film music, a lot of the, I'm using quotes, traditional or classic styling is rooted in like 19th century romantic music.
Definitely, yeah.
How has your prior studying and specialization sort of affected your approach, your thought process of film and TV music?
Cool. That's a very cool question. I think that the basic, if you try and understand sort of tonality or phrasing, and you compare the 18th century with the 16th, clearly the parameters were shifting. The whole idea of modes and the whole idea of how long a phrase should be, the whole sense of rhythm is clearly shifting. From the 18th to the 19th century, I feel like it's actually more of a slight twisting of the dials that results in a lot of different language. So actually, I think that the background I have in 18th century stuff is surprisingly useful.
Hmm.
Like if you've got that sort of Mozartian style in your fingers, I think you can like twist the dials and get to, Chopin or even later. But what basically what I'm leading to saying is I find it more useful than I thought I would. It may
Hmm.
influence the kinds of jobs I get. I mean, actually, a really good example is cartoon music of the sort of Tom and Jerry or Looney Tunes variety. When they borrow things, or when they're in a style, they're often sometimes it's sort of like a Sousa march. Well, a Sousa march is very kind of periodic and very tonal. So again, it's kind of not too far from the 18th century. They use lots of Italian opera. They love like Rossini, and Rossini again is not that far away. So I find it weirdly when I'm doing sort of cartoon music, the shapes that I have from that 18th century style are much more useful than I would have thought. I think as an outsider, I would have, before I'd gotten into the weeds, I would have thought, well, the 18th century is all like harpsichords and frilly collars and men in high heels. It's not really related to the vernacular, as you said. Like it seems like the vernacular of TV music is more romantic, but actually, I find it more useful than I would have realized.
In talking about some of the music that's used in cartoons, especially that style of cartoons, I think it's really easy, and I've said this before that I'm guilty of it as well, is seeing something that seems like it's directed more at a younger audience and would have therefore a less sophisticated music. But then, like you're saying, you watch those older cartoons and they are not only using, or borrowing from a lot of these very well-known pieces, but developing it themselves. So, because you work a lot in that space as well, does that sort of surprise you, the level that you're able to get to?
It does, yeah. It's really interesting. I suppose cartoons in that golden age were more for everyone than we now recognize or we now realize, because they would play them before movies. And I don't think they developed that like in the States, especially, actually in the UK too, they have that Saturday morning association, where you kind of get up. I don't know if they still do it, but you get up on a Saturday morning and TV would have classic, Roadrunner on it or something. Whereas in the original context, it was maybe more for everyone. And I think there were all these kind of ambitious ideas about this new medium. There's an essay knocking around by Chuck Jones where he's making ambitious claims for what cartoons might one day be able to achieve because they're so abstract. He's kind of comparing them to abstract painting and things like that. And so I suppose against that backdrop, then you have these composers, as you say, throwing themselves into the task. I mean, yes, so Scott Bradley and Carl Stalling are my two sort of heroes in that era. But all the Disney people are great too. Anytime I get stuck into one of those scores, if I can actually get hold of the score, it's just always so intimidating and amazing. And there's really nothing that I could criticize about it. I've talked about Pinocchio before. I absolutely adore Pinocchio, the score to that. I was looking not that long ago at the Mickey Mouse March from the Mickey Mouse Club, the marching band. The backing is all marching band, and then it has the singing on top of it. And the arrangement is just brilliant. The resources are used perfectly. You have that whole generation of people who are very comfortable doing big band arrangements and writing for marching band and doing very, very good vocal arrangements. I was looking at the vocal arrangements from Bambi once, and it all just looks great. There's no cheating. It doesn't look hurried. It's amazing. So it's always very nourishing getting into that stuff.
Do you think that aspect is something that is going away or is at risk of being lost a little bit?
Well, I suppose for some reason I have some. I mean, the obvious, based on everything I just said. I mean, it would be very easy to be very pessimistic about it. I suppose we have to recognize that music now is so different. The field of music is so different. I mean, the things that you have to know, there are things you have to know about now that hadn't been invented then. So we're sort of spread over a different and perhaps broader terrain. It is sad if you love all that old stuff. It's sad to think that we struggle to achieve that same thing now. But yeah, it's also amazing. It was always amazing to me when I arrived in California 15, 20 years ago, the way everyone was such an expert in. Everyone could do so much on their own already, and that's only accelerated now. The composers knew about microphones and they played lots of instruments and they knew how to fix their own computer and so there are things about the way film music is now that shouldn't be overlooked. It's sort of charming in a way, actually, sometimes when you're watching a movie, you're literally hearing the person who wrote the music. You're hearing their fingerprints on it more tangibly than you used to. So I suppose in a way that's cool. There's some thinking about. I love the music to Severance, the Teddy Shapiro score, and you could clearly hear him playing lots of these strange percussion instruments, sound design instruments. I love Dom Lewis's music, and you can often hear that it's Dom himself singing, tracking himself up and creating these vocal effects, and that's very cool. It's very, very interesting. So I'm giving a sort of hedgy answer, but I mean, the natural thing would be yes to say, oh, it is rather sad. I do sometimes marvel at how good everyone was at these old-fashioned things back then.
It's funny you mentioned Dom Lewis because I interviewed him about this time last year, and it was something
cool.
that I didn't know at first. So it was about the film Bullet Train. He had scored that, and
Yes, yeah, love it.
I can't remember the tracks at this point, but his voice is on some of that, and so it was interesting then hearing the score, watching the film, and then talking to him and being like, oh, I recognize that voice because I just heard it 2 days ago when I watched the film. It's not something that I think about, and I don't think many people do, but it is interesting because that's more than basically anyone besides the people appearing in the film.
Right.
The composer can literally put themselves in it.
Right. And it's even true in my things in contexts where you might not realize it, because I do a lot of these slightly more old school sounding things. But, the pianos and the organs and the accordions and stuff like that are generally me. Of course, I'm not getting a blank check to record every single thing. So often, even when a score sounds very old school, there may be fake elements, or there may be, the percussion might not actually have been done in the room, even if it sounds kind of orchestral. It might be me playing my own suspended cymbal and other nonsense like that. What's your instrument?
You can see over my shoulder I have a classic guitar, and I have an electric guitar somewhere as well. Candidly, at this point, they are so much more for show than any skill I have. Well, I played back in the day, and I made some drone music as well, but unfortunately, the tide of time's caught up with me a little bit, and I keep telling myself, I keep promising I'll pick it back up, and I do, and then 6 months pass, and I go, oh, whoops.
Right. The whole realm of guitar-like instruments is what really bothers me, because if I could get, I think, to a certain level on one of them, I would immediately find it useful, and I would use it more. I would actually do it every day in my own music, and then it would be easy enough to buy another one. Switch to ukulele or. What people have told me is that what I need to do is to get decent at the mandolin, because I play the violin.
Oh, interesting.
Not very well, but I play the violin again enough to play on my own things in some contexts, and so that keeps me picking it up. And the mandolin, of course, has the same tuning. So that's what I should do. I'm thinking of getting myself a mandolin, see if I can get on that.
You need
get
to
on
find
that road.
something maybe a little Mediterranean to score, because then you can, fit into the music, and then it's a great excuse or a great impetus for you to spend the time to really learn it, at least to some sort of competent extent.
I agree. You have to be sort of, in this industry, you have to be sort of forced into things by circumstances. Yeah.
And so I do want to go back. You had mentioned, I know that I had read, you coming to California, like you said, 15, 20 years ago. And I don't know the timing exactly, but you had worked with some composers like Harry and Rupert Gregson Williams, Carter Burwell, Henry Jackman. It's an approach that some composers take, some just put themselves out there. Again, just a different start. But working with composers like that, how did that affect your approach, your understanding to and of film and TV music?
Well, that's right, and it was very, very formative. So I didn't go to film school, and I didn't study film music, so I didn't have any of those experiences of learning about the craft of it through school. I had this decent sort of musical skill. I think I was a good composer, but I was basically showing up and needing to be taught how to actually write film music. I was like a doctor needing to be trained how to become a vet or something like that. It's a big difference, and actually it's much bigger than I realized at the time. I was youthful and rash. So the first person I worked for was Rupert Gregson Williams, as you say, and so I really learned all of the fundamentals from Rupert. I'm still very grateful to him for that, because otherwise I would have had nothing. So even just day to day, what are you supposed to do? How do the computers work? Rupert did he have a room at remote control then? He was still friendly with remote control and with Hans Zimmer, and there was a collection of composers that were working in a vaguely similar way. If you could move from one of them to like, for instance, actually, I was working for Rupert and then I worked for Harry, and their key commands were pretty similar. Their key commands in Cubase were all not the Cubase ones, but they were quite close to each other. That sort of gives you a taste of how all of those composers were sort of in this sort of collective. And so, yeah, just how the technical side of it, bringing the film in and working out how the music is going to take up a certain amount of space. And I remember having conversations with Rupert about things that are unbelievably basic. Like, I just couldn't seem to get I knew a lot about music, a little, as we talked about, I knew a lot about classical music. And it was very difficult for me to write something that didn't sort of develop and morph and change and sort of actually almost, I found it hard to write anything that didn't sort of crescendo. And so I really, having to learn from him that there are times in film music where you have to learn different skills. I mean, you can't just sort of follow your nose the whole time. If two people are having a conversation, then the music has to find a way to stay under that conversation. I was enormously I learned lots of things from all of the people that you mentioned. It was amazing, actually, to move from one to another and realize that, in spite of the similarities I talked about, that their style was so different. Their style of talking to a director was so different. The way they thought and talked about things was so different. Carter Burwell, I learned an enormous amount from. Actually, I suppose because he was very separate. I only worked with him quite briefly, but I was just so impressed at his sort of how patient he was and how thoughtful, and the notes that he gave me were so incredibly patient and well thought through. And he took every film he did very seriously. He thought very deeply about the film's themes in a dramatic sense. So just in terms of the vocation, I kind of just picked up. Might be surprised if he heard me waxing lyrical about this, because it was quite brief that I helped him out. But I was very impressed with that, and just with his whole sort of aura and his whole philosophy.
Interesting. And I obviously want to talk about Lamya's poem and your work on that, but simply because remote control and Hans Zimmer came up, I read an article earlier today about the director Gareth Edwards, and he may have been mentioning this half-jokingly, but that for the upcoming film The Creator, he had first tried to use AI to score the film in a Hans Zimmer style, before eventually bringing on Hans himself to score it instead. And so I'm just curious, because it's fresh of mind and it's such a simmering topic at the moment, whether that's anything that you've run into, or whether you've come across it enough to have any thoughts on AI in music in film.
Right. Well, I think the development of machine learning in the last few years has shown us that clearly none of us has any idea what it's going to be able to do really well and what it's going to never actually, or be not be able to do until it can do everything. So it's very hard to make any predictions. I have a feeling in terms of music that it's struggling to do things that are, you see a few examples showing up online of it being sort of given like library music style prompts and coming up with something. And I think at the moment those are very cherry picked. And if you actually get a demo from someone, you realize that most of the time it still doesn't actually understand that if something starts in, it doesn't understand what 4/4 is, for instance. And so it'll just, every bar will be a weird different length. And it just, there's just some incredibly basic things you realize that it hasn't managed to glean. And, the chords that follow each other are utterly at random. But who knows? It could have a massive breakthrough. Someone, actually, I think it might have been Elyse, pointed out the other day when we were talking about a situation where someone had done what the director asked and then it had crashed and burned. And she was saying, well, yeah, that sort of demonstrates the problem with AI, that half of the film composer's job is to interpret what people say and to realize that they may not actually want what they think they want. And I think that's a good point. And that sort of extends all the way into the texture of the music. I think when you're writing the music, you're doing something very humane and very psychoanalytical watching the movie and responding to it. So maybe AI might do some very flashy things, but the idea of it genuinely doing what we're doing anytime soon seems as remote as it, just being like a person in any real sense, which I think it is not. Another interesting thing I've heard recently, I don't know how it's interesting. I don't know how much this would affect film music, but I have a friend actually who works in machine learning, so I get lots of little dispatches from him, and he tells me that to take the text models as an example, you might have noticed that they generally don't give you they can't do things that are enormously long. They can give you something that's several paragraphs long, but we haven't seen example, or cover letters, writing letters for you. The trouble is that the compute required, once you're 100 words into a thing, if you're the model, you're analyzing everything that you've already written and then using that as the basis of what to write next. The further you get into it, the compute multiplies. So the more paragraphs of text, or almost every word of text, you're creating a situation that's more complicated. So he tells me, with the current technology, it would not be remotely conceivable that an AI could actually write a film screenplay or a novel, because they are massively too long. The computer would need to be the size of the universe to get beyond about 4 pages. And so if you're talking about writing a symphony, I imagine the same problem would apply. It might be able to come up with a nice sort of opening allegro, but it would have the same problem, that it would need to go back and refer to the start of the piece for every new bar that it writes. And so at a certain point, it would just explode. Now, whether that actually applies to film music is an interesting question. Maybe the film music just needs to respond to the film and doesn't really need any themes or any structure or any kind of...
I mean, now you're getting into more abstract question of what film music requires or needs or means whatsoever.
I mean, I have this very like symphonic conception of film music, and I think generally I can't help but think that way. That generally I start kind of wanting the end of the film to feel like it's wrapping up in a way that is like I would hope that a symphony would do that. But does it need to do that? I'm not sure.
Well, and that is a nice segue, because your work on Lamya's poem, obviously quite symphonic, thematic, flows exactly like that, where it does have a nice narrative feel. And I will say I enjoy both the stranger, more experimental sounds in film music, as well as things that are a bit more classical in various definitions of the word. So it's always nice to hear a score like this, where right from the beginning you hear this just really gorgeous, luscious melody that then permeates throughout in various incarnations. So for anyone that hasn't heard at least some of the singles that you've released yet, I know the score comes out in about a week and a half. I would recommend that, because that main theme is just wonderful.
Oh, thank you. That's very, very nice. What the score was going to be wandered around quite a bit actually before it took shape. There had been an idea that it would be very big, but there probably wouldn't be the budget, so it would be very big in an in the box kind of way. And then as we explored more, we realized that it didn't want to be this sort of a big in the sense of I don't know, sort of conventional, lots of fake choir and fake orchestra, and that went away. And then we had this very, very interesting conversation about the Syrian or the Arabic elements. I've said this on some other podcasts, so if any listeners have heard me say this, I apologize. You can skip forward 60 seconds. But the producer is Syrian, and there are various other people involved who were able to tell me that Middle Eastern audiences often find what Hollywood movies do, when Hollywood movies are doing the Middle East and are as well-intentioned as possible, they can find it rather irritating, because although Hollywood composers do their research and use instruments that are geographically appropriate, they're generally very ancient instruments. And so to Middle Eastern audiences, they all read not so much as, oh, it's the Oud, it's my home country. It's more like, oh, it's the Oud. You're saying that we're 1,000 years in the past. So the film starts in New York and has all this EDM, and then it switches to Aleppo, and suddenly we're hearing the Oud and the Ney and stuff, and it seems to be saying, oh, here we are in the windswept desert of the the dawn of civilization. So I wanted to be very intentional about what Middle Eastern elements to use, and so I did focus on the Persian ney, and worked with Hossein Omumi, who's this great virtuoso on the instrument, and sort of let him take the front seat in the scenes that he was going to play on, and also just wanted to check that we were doing it for the right reason. So in the movie, one of the main characters is Rumi, and Rumi is actually in the past, in pre-Renaissance. And Rumi used the image of the flute a lot, reeds and flutes. And so it felt resonant and appropriate. But I wanted to make it sort of intentional and just that one element, and not just sort of keep throwing dumbeks and every Middle Eastern instrument that I could think of at the score. But so we ended up with the sound that you describe. I'm glad that you're feeling that it has a shape across the span of the movie. I do like to try and do that if I can. I was finding, as you probably noticed, I was finding that I wasn't able to use the theme directly that much. But there are ways, if you don't modulate that much, and you do certain things, that there are ways to sort of allude to it all the time, so that you feel vaguely like you're in that terrain all the way through the film, even if you're not hearing it kind of front and center with a big neon sign over it.
And maybe you don't want to give out state secrets, which is fine. But what are ways that you can allude to a theme without simply repeating it 25 times?
That's a brilliant question. One thing I like to think of is that if you look at a melody and you think about what repeats in a melody, what from the first phrase, what are we listening to? What are we listening out for? Why does it make any sense to us at all? You'd be surprised the extent to which clearly when you listen and when everybody listens, pitch and time are actually separable from each other. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star feels repetitive, but it feels repetitive because the rhythm is repetitive, not the pitches. The fact that that makes any sense to you at all tells you immediately that your brain is able to separate the rhythm from the pitch. And so that's a thing that we do a lot with a melody, is to use the rhythm more than once, but not the pitch. And you can actually do the opposite as well. So in Lamya's poem, we sort of have this like... We have this note quite a lot, this B. And what I find that I can do later in the score is to sort of... I can arrive there again and again, and it feels vaguely familiar to you, even though it's not really anything. It's just a B. It's not like a tune. So thinking of pitch and time as being separate, and you can gob onto one without the other, that's one little hot tip that I have.
The moment you mentioned it, I've had Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star repeating through my head and thinking about the rhythm in particular. So if that persists throughout the afternoon, I'm going to send you a very angry, nasty email. But we've got a few minutes left. I do really quick want to talk about Demon 79, which is a Black Mirror episode that you had scored. It's such an interesting piece of yours to listen to, because here you are, you've been talking about how you have this, I don't want to say constant approach, but you often, have a familiarity with like the symphonic palette. And then you hear Demon 79 and it is very different, much more horror-oriented. That last cue in particular is scary stuff. And it seems so different from everything else you're doing. So I just wanted to see, like, what drew you to that project, and was it difficult doing something seemingly so different from the rest of your filmography?
Cool, yeah. Well, there are a couple of things that help to sort of like connective tissue. One is that when I was approached about it, or when I came on board, there were already certain things that Toby Haynes, the director, and Charlie Brooker were listening to and thinking about and talking about. And they were basically already talking about concert music from the sort of 70s, the bleeding edge avant-garde, Penderecki and Ligeti. And, well, they were listening to some Bartok as well, but of course that's earlier. And so in a way it took on the shape of something which is a bit of a pattern for me, which is going into something and doing a bunch of homework on this particular era. I had just finished doing it on Schmigadoon, the second season, when I went straight from that to Demon 79. So I'd been listening a lot to Sweeney Todd and Cabaret and Chicago and things like that, and just trying to understand them and talking to the arrangers, the song arrangers on Schmigadoon about those things. And so, yeah, I was going straight from that into looking very closely at Ligeti and Penderecki and all of that. But as you say, the shaping is very different. The sentiment is very different. I like a lot of people, I think. I like a lot of kinds of music and a lot of kinds of movies, and I don't necessarily get to do all the things that I like, and it's really nice when I suddenly can. So I love horror music, that whole history, and I like recent ones. I love what Joseph Bishara does in the Conjuring movies. I saw him at a party once, and it was great talking to him about what on earth are you doing there? And actually, Elyse has sung on some of his scores. So I love that whole realm. I'd love to do one that was less in that historical box sometime and more just sort of insane, like he does. But the other thing is actually very often, because of the cartoons that I've done, very often when I get asked to do something now, I have already done something not a million miles away, very briefly in a cartoon, because I've done like sort of death metal here, and I've done this little Bollywood one, and I did one sort of set in Venice, and and actually there's a horror Mickey Mouse where the music just leans right into. Actually, there are possibly two, but there's one called Just the Four of Us, where the music is. If you heard the music on your own, you would have absolutely no idea that it was a cartoon. In fact, I remember the instrumental contractor being really worried while we were recording about how this could possibly be appropriate for children, because there's all the horror effects in it, and it was absolutely horrible sounding. So yeah, so the funny thing, I had done a bit of horror before. Actually, I did I'm realizing now I did do a short horror movie a few years ago, but yeah, the Mickey Mouse, actually very often that show prepares me for getting a more legit request to do a thing later in my career. It's rarely now the first time I've been asked to do a thing, because there's often a Mickey Mouse.
I love it, and like you said, you would not expect that whatsoever, and I love that there's that sort of musical openness for something like Mickey Mouse. I mean, that's awesome.
Isn't that unexpected? Also, I should say, doing those cartoons trains you in making things work on a tight budget. Which again, I don't know if I'll ever lose that. But, so that Mickey Mouse, I remember trying to figure out how to do string effects and how to do the choir with two people tracked up and all these things. And then to a surprising extent, those tricks are all useful later, because you never seem to have enough time and you never seem to have enough money. So those ways of being thrifty never get old.
I'm glad you find ways around it. If any, studio execs are listening, give more time and money, but I don't know if they necessarily are. But Chris, I'm so glad you could sit down and chat with me. And I should have led with this 45 minutes ago. I've been a huge fan of your music since seeing The Death of Stalin, whenever that was, 6 years ago, 5 years ago now. So I just wish you did more music, because it's always a joy whenever you have a new score coming out.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. It's been great talking to you. Really, really fun.
Awesome.
And yeah, to be continued, I hope.
Yeah, let's hope so.